Sorry, I'm just putting the right view here. So welcome, Joel and Miriam. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. I have to say that I discovered you when we did our opera night about 5 weeks ago now, I think, or a month ago. It feels like it was yesterday, but it's actually a long time ago. And it was a great success, that opera night. We have about 100 people who were watching, and that was great. So your story is really interesting, and I really wanted to share it with my audience and my guests. I'm going to start with Joel. You both have a colorful and fascinating story. So I'm going to start with Joel, who believes is the less interesting of the two.
Right.
Joel is Canadian and grew up in a family of pastors from the Salvation Army. You moved a lot around Canada, no exotic destination, but Canada is exotic for some people, so we won't take that away from you. You went to university, did a music degree, and decided that you were not going to be a pastor. You were going to change the course and enter the exciting world of opera and performance. You are currently the artistic director for opera at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity, and you are also your bio says the founder, but is it the co-founder of Against the Grain?
Yeah, there's a group of us that kind of started that company almost 10 years ago now, yeah.
All right. We'll come back to that. You are the artistic director and co-founder of Against the Grain, which has a really interesting approach to opera, and I'll let you go into that. And I've read that you are known as the enfant terrible of Canadian opera. So, enters Miriam. Miriam, you are Lebanese. You grew up in Syria, and you moved to Ottawa with your parents when you were 7, which must have been quite a change, if not a trauma. Music has always been in your blood, and you always have been fearless, and nothing has ever stopped you, and you never understood why you should have limitations, and that has enabled you to get to the top and performing on many international stages, including at Glyndebourne. You did your major role debut with the Canadian Opera Company in the role of Mimi in La Bohème, and I shared a little extract of that, which was absolutely spectacular. I was so sorry it was so short, because I thought it was magnificent. And I grew up with a mother who revered La Calas, and I thought, she's got nothing on you. And you are also a co-founder of Against the Grain. So welcome to both of you. We will take questions as we go along, and the questions will be in sorry, the page mark, my screen has suddenly changed, in the chat, that's right. So if you want to ask the question, just put it into the chat screen, and we will take the questions from time to time. Joel, how does one decide to go from, I have to start there. We'll just get it out of the way. How does one decide to go from pastoral life to opera life?
That's a very good question. I think for me, it was a thing where I come from a family of 4. There's 4 of us kids, and our mother was very theatrical and dramatic, even within the Salvation Army, and the 4 of us would be putting on little plays when we didn't know that we had a choice. And so music and theater was always sort of a part of my upbringing, but obviously predominantly was this message of faith and ministry, especially in the Salvation Army, where they tend to focus more on those who are kind of the least, the lost, and the forgotten. I'm sure there's another L word, but I forgot what that was. So I said forgotten.
Right.
And so it sort of, I had this empathy towards people, but this love of art and music. And I was sort of at that time a big fan of musical theater, which was always exciting. I directed a musical in university and was in one as well. And so that was my love of music sort of in a theatrical sense. But then someone pointed me towards opera, and it was like a wider net. It tends to be that musicals are generally more American, whereas opera is a worldwide phenomenon. And that sort of really appealed to me from someone who was used to traveling. Yes, it was all pretty much within Canada, but I wasn't sort of tied to specific routes. I was free to kind of explore anything. And it just sort of arrived at the right time in my life where I had seen Miriam, but we hadn't really met. So it was kind of, I was a lone wolf and felt that I could go anywhere and do anything. So it kind of seemed like a natural fit. Again, I don't know if I told you this, but I first heard the overture to Marriage of Figaro, Mozart's famous opera, but I heard it in a brass band before I ever heard it live or with an orchestra. So it was a different type of music. And so the colors of an orchestra and the power of opera singers just really took me over. And it was a world that I was really excited to learn more about.
Mm. So I'm interested to hear what you're saying, that empathy and human side, you were able to carry that on in the music and in the roles, because I have questions about how you choose an opera and all that. So.
Well, I again, university only. I did a little bit of acting, and I loved diving into the characters. And as a director, you get to dive into every character's story. You get to dive into the entire story. And so I would apply this humanity, I guess, or this sort of empathy towards people, and I would pour that into trying to understand the characters and their relationships between each other, and how that's manifested into the music as well. And so for me, it was almost like psychology, but beautifully presented, and to have a say in how it looks and feels was just intoxicating. Yeah.
So when you decide which opera you are going to create, is it just the music, or is it also the characters and their human characteristics? I would say the character that attracts you, that makes you decide, I'm going to do this one because it corresponds to what I feel now, to what's happening in the current moment? Or how do you choose that?
It's a good one as well. I think I'm drawn to either the music or the characters in the story, and then you hope that the other side matches up, meaning if it's beautiful music, how ridiculous, or opera plots can get a bit ridiculous. So it's kind of, is that something that can speak to you or to your audience, or this incredible story, and just you hope that the music will match it and sort of stir the emotions inside, which you feel just by reading it.
Right. So that brings me nicely to Miriam, because you are playing characters that are so far from what you grew up with, and what I suspect, even living in Canada most of your life, you probably are in a very Middle Eastern environment. It's your culture, it's your parents' culture. I mean, one never loses that. So how do you try to feel what the character must be feeling according to the libretto, the story, or do you just decide, you know what, I'm just going to put my own culture and color to it and go with that? How does that work?
I think inevitably you always end up putting part of yourself into the character, because that's what you have to offer. So I think in everything that sort of I approach in terms of character, in terms of music, I start by learning the notes and then the words. And then I don't know what it is about music, and it's probably because it underscores the emotional side of the character, that it takes you on this journey anyway, and you end up feeling those feelings, and everybody feels those feelings differently. So when you're preparing on your own, you bring all of that, and then you give yourself a backstory if you're not, living with the director. So you give yourself the story, you give yourself, the permission, and you give yourself all these things until you walk into the rehearsal room, and then the director tells you their vision of what your character is. And then in that month or so of working on the character with everybody else, you bring out the different colors that with the interactions of the different character. But you always inevitably bring yourself into the room with that character, and slowly you start to shape it in the image of what someone else has in mind. And sometimes they might love what you brought, and they might just say that's fantastic, and but you always have to bring yourself, otherwise you have nothing to say.
Yeah.
So yeah, culturally, I think culturally for me, I know that, like, like Joel will attest, I'm a very emotional person, and I think that sort of like we wear our hearts on our sleeves. We kind of, in my family, say how we feel. We're just sort of, it's always very apparent. So finding those emotions has never been sort of like a struggle for me. So that's kind of a fun thing to sort of explore as well, because in opera it's the very extremes that we're going for, and so that's what drew me to opera. So even though it's not completely similar, it is very much like sympathetic to each other.
So the challenge for you would be more when you are requested to restrain the emotions and just be I don't want to say more subtle, but show it in a more understated way.
Yeah, or like perhaps something that I hadn't imagined. So like we did an opera about 10 years ago, or maybe a little bit less, and it was Turn of the Screw, and Joel had this image of this scene, and I said, no, I disagree. And he's like, well, I'm the director. So you have to listen to me, because it's so easy to be well, like in our relationship, just kind of have just a 50-50 say, but when it gets on this stage, it's like the director has the final say. He's like, well, at least just try it. You wouldn't argue with anyone else if it wasn't me. If it was someone else, you would just try it. So that sort of thing, where it's someone, because quite often it's an image in their head that you have to sort of replicate, and you just try, you do your best, you go for it, give it 100%.
So Joel, how does the image come in your head? I mean, to create La Bohème in a bar or in a Legion Hall, I mean, how do you dream up this thing? What is the catalyst that says, you know what, this is going to be that way, and this is how I feel it and I interpret it?
Yeah, that was sort of the first big show that our company here in Toronto did. And 10 years ago, I had been living for about 5 months in Norway, in Oslo, and got to see sort of opera done on a very different scale. Whereas looking at a piece that would appeal to, or a piece that most people would recognize, and La Bohème would be one of those titles. And the piece, just looking at the text and what it's about these poor artists who don't have much money, who are living and caring about each other. And again, when all you know about opera maybe it is what has been presented to you, it's presented on a large scale in a big auditorium with lots of opulence, and this story is the opposite of that. And so for me, it said, well, what if the environment that the audience approached this piece was also fitting of the piece itself? And that sort of led to saying, well, what if we put this opera, what if the characters in the opera were the characters of this community, of this, of where this actual Legion Hall or bar is, and they're at a table just across from you. And that's kind of, even now, we're all zooming in from all over, but we each have our own stories, and we have our own sort of connections and people in our lives, and that's what triggered that. So it's, in some ways, it was breaking a rule by putting it in this very dingy place. But what that did was it brought out new colors and characters in the opera and the relationship to this piece when it was so close and intimate and very stripped down.
Mm. It's amazing. So, I mean, talking about stories and broadening the stories, I think that Miriam coming in your life was more of a shock to your system than you in hers, from what I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just quickly say that she again, her background and her culture, her first language was Arabic. It's something that for me was very different, but I think a big word I used was exotic at the beginning. And
right.
She dressed like a gypsy almost at times, with these colorful skirts, and kind of bewitched me that way. But it was something that really opened my mind, not just to the art that I was interested in, her being an up and coming opera singer, but also just personality wise. We lived in the same city at one point in Ottawa, and yet we had such different backgrounds, and yet we were so in tune in terms of our passion for the art and the work that we do, but also in our families and the way that we believe in things. So it was very different, but also exactly what we were looking for. I don't know if she knew that at the time, but yeah.
There were more points of contact than you anticipated.
Yeah.
How are you guys keeping at the moment? I mean, Miriam, how do you keep your voice trained? Take us a little bit into that world, because I don't think that many people know how an opera singer trains and prepares. And I have my neighbor right here is also an opera singer. I forget his last name, Alain something. And he tells me that sometimes he spends days without uttering a word to rest his voice. As a mother, can you do that?
No. No, you can't. In fact, it's funny because our 6-year-old, when I was doing my premiere for La Bohème, he got strep throat 3 times within like the stretch of, I don't know, what was it, 2.5 months? And it was terrifying because I still have to live with him. And I was taking care of him as well, because Joel was busy at the time as well. So it was kind of this like, go to the doctor, what is it? It's strep throat. And I'm like, and how long will I know till I have it? And so that was kind of a really scary thing. So you do have to take really good care of yourself. You have to figure out ways. What's happened with me is that I've had to kind of become less terrified of getting sick and knowing how to deal with it. So the minute I feel like even like a little tickle in my throat, I will immediately, just go to the doctor and ask, am I getting sick? Can you do a swab? Like, just find, so it's being very diligent about that. And then
do you train every day, or how does that work?
Right now I'm not training every day, but usually I train every day. Right now, after having him, I gave myself a little bit of a break, but now I'm starting to sing more on a daily basis. So it's just a little bit harder right now with everybody in the house. So that's the thing. So the basement has become a little bit of a refuge when I need to sing.
And do you have a coach who works with you, or they
normally yes? And so I haven't. I will slowly get in touch with my teacher. I have a team. So I have a teacher, a voice teacher, a person that does body work with me to work on the proper muscles. So now that it's been 6 weeks, he's 7 weeks old now, I can be a little bit more intense about it. So I wanted to give myself a proper break. Right. Now, the first time I had my first son, I was singing 5 weeks. I had my first concert was 5 weeks after having him. So I was singing a lot sooner. So I was singing about a week and a half after having my son.
Wow. So, that's amazing.
So it's just a matter of keeping things flexible, warming up, and things change. So right now things feel different. Hormonally, everything kind of, so you kind of have to stay in touch with all of that as you do your training. And it's super important to be in touch with your teacher so that they're in tune as well, and that you have
Right.
ears on the outside, not just on the inside when you're working.
Ava has a question. Do you think as opera singers that you already practice mindfulness? You must know how to go into yourself correctly as you're performing on stage.
Yes, that's a big thing. As we're kind of training, the one big thing that you get a lot of rejection, you get a lot of sort of things that come your way as obstacles. And so you sort of have to learn to stay centered throughout all of these things that are happening. And it's also a lot of multitasking. Now, I think I thought I was practicing mindfulness before, and I probably was to a certain extent, but after having my kids, it was even more important to have that. And it also kind of brought a new purpose and a new kind of perspective on things, which makes it, you kind of realize that nothing really matters in a way more than your family.
That's
and
right.
That takes a lot of the pressure off in a way, because you realize that the music is a vehicle, and it's something that sort of it's an emotional vehicle to sort of, and it's also like a way of expressing and and bringing people into your sort of expression, but it's not necessarily who you are. And that's a big thing, because you can sort of, it's not a separation, but there's a lot of freedom in that, and you find a lot more sort of ability to let go. And so that was a big thing with the mindfulness. Yeah, great question.
And Noreen is asking, what's your dream role, the one you haven't performed yet?
Well, I love Tatiana in Eugene Onegin.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about it, for those of us who know zero about opera?
She's a dreamer. She is in love with a man who is sort of not attainable to her. He's kind of, this man who she thinks is a lot more educated and a different class. And she writes him this really beautiful letter about how she feels, and he rejects her. So it's this kind of like emotional journey as you see this kind of girl grow up, as she's sort of like realizing how she feels about somebody. And then she, eventually grows up and marries someone that is of a higher station, and she becomes that person. And then Eugene Onegin eventually comes back and says, will you have me? And she can't, she's married. It's too late. So it's this thing of, it's what, it's life. And, but not, on a very operatic scale of wanting something and still wanting it, but having to reject it, because of your responsibilities so it's quite a beautiful, and the music is unbelievable, and it just sits perfectly in the voice, and that kind of the Russian kind of temperament is wonderful.
But it's also very dramatic, a little bit like anybody on the Mediterranean coast there.
Yes, exactly.
So how do we manage family life when there are two very busy schedules, and travel and late night performances and early morning baby calls and all that? How does that happen? Well, at the moment it's not, but it will.
Yeah, it's a weird time, because obviously this little guy in my arms is 7 weeks old, and he was born sort of just as this was all starting. And I was meant to go to Banff, Alberta in just over a week to begin our summer program, which was canceled. And, knowing how this has been now, I don't know how that was meant to work. But I think when we decided we wanted to have kids, we said that we wouldn't let that get in the way of our passions and our dreams of directing opera, producing opera, and singing an opera. And so far, we've been able to do that with a lot of help from family. up until school started, we just brought them everywhere. We lived about a year of our lives with our older son. The three of us, we just went moving around from place to place. We were in Los Angeles for a while, and then Minnesota and Fargo and Toronto. So
Right.
now it's looking, I think this in a lot of ways has been a good moment for us to sort of reprioritize what is important in this time when things are taken away from you. And I would much rather have opera taken away from me than my family.
Yeah.
And so that certainly rebalanced the scales for us.
Yeah, I think it has done that for just about everybody. Everybody's priorities have changed, and but I think, I mean, we now have had about 8 conversations with artists, and what we've heard from most of the artists is also a change in priorities, but also an opportunity to recenter and then to create again something different. So, what do you think is coming up for you? What have you got your eyes on?
Well, that's, because of this epidemic against the grain, we've taken a lot of what we've done, we've pivoted, and we're putting a lot more content online. And a lot of that was started with the virtual salon that we did with you guys. And so that's allowed us to kind of really accelerate. It's about time, I think, that classical music does advance and become more technological, not being afraid of technology. And I think we're all having to learn quite a bit within the industry, and some of it are more excited about it than others. And so we're looking at, what does operas that could live outside, what do those look like? And what does a drive-in, there used to be drive-in movies, and we're hearing about drive-in operas now, and what could that look like? And are we the company that could do that? I see
Right.
Debbie's question,
Yes.
does it focus on traditional opera, or does it include contemporary new opera? We used to take traditional opera and then put a spin on it to try to make it more relevant and contemporary, but now we're starting to dive into more contemporary opera and new opera. In March, we would have had and into April, we would have had our first original commission of a brand new opera that we had to postpone, and we're hoping that it will happen sometime soon. And it would have featured the first transgendered opera singer in Canada. And so that would have
Good for you.
an exciting revelation for, I think, the industry at large, to take something that is so focused on the voice and to take a singer who is, I don't want to say is the opposite of that, but whose voice is different and sort of stands out from the norm. We were really looking forward to that, and hopefully we'll be able to present her in the future. So.
We'll wrap up in a minute. I just wanted you to tell us a little bit about Bound, your show that unfortunately you couldn't launch because of the lockdown. The story, I think, is quite fascinating. Do you want to share that with us a little bit? And maybe, are you going to put it online? Are you going to offer it virtually?
We offered, I wonder even if I could, I'm sure I could, I'll send the link I'll put it in the link. We made a self-isolation video with the orchestra and singers of one of the musical numbers of the piece. So I'll put that in the chat box afterwards. But what we did was, as a group, over 3 years, we looked at music that spoke to the singers. And so the reference was Handel's music. And so, for example, Miriam chose a piece of music from Alcina. And what we did was we found stories in our current news feeds of refugees and people who were displaced or dehumanized. And what I did was I took the text of people who spoke in these news articles and put that into Handel's music. And what we did was we wove a storyline based on a fictional state that was holding these people into isolated rooms for questioning. And they didn't know what they were there for, and they didn't know how long they were there for. And over 3 years, we distilled this down to 4 characters, one of them being a woman, a Muslim woman who is being forced to remove her hijab. And that Miriam, who is not Muslim, portrayed that, which was educational for her in sort of respect for people. we had a transgendered character who we started with as a countertenor. And if you don't know what a countertenor is, it's a male voice who sings with, not as falsetto, but the voice that comes out when he sings sounds like a woman's voice, and he's trained himself that way. So this year we were excited to take that character's journey into an actual transgender opera singer. And then another character was someone who came to Canada to study, to bring all his educational learnings back to his home country, and the state had issues with that as well. So it was diving into cultural and relevant and social issues, again, sort of full circle back to my background, which I think people who were used to our companies were expecting the funny La Bohemes and the Mozarts, and they're like, where are those? Those are the things that we liked, but we really wanted to get into a bit more of the political and see what that felt like for us.
And just to add, we had Kevin Lau, Canadian composer, take Handel's music and just completely dissect it and make it his own. And he added a completely contemporary spin to that music. So it was like Handel, but deviated in the most kind of interesting and beautiful way.
Amazing. Quick question from Debbie. Do you do vocal recitals, Miriam, not just during COVID-19, but on a regular basis?
I do recitals. Usually I try to do 1 or 2 a year. And they're some of my favorite things to do because I can bring my own sort of spin on things. I can sing, the melody and the art song and the leader, but I also usually do an Arabic set. And that's usually one of my big things that I love to do, is to bring that repertoire into that space as well.
That's fantastic. Do your children speak Arabic?
My older son's taking Arabic lessons, but I haven't. I only spoke to him in Arabic when we started, and that was great. And then somehow now I speak to him in English. So like his grandparents still speak to him in Arabic, but I have to be a little bit more strict. Yeah.
Well, thank you so very much, really. And Junior here has been exemplary.
Fallen asleep. I knew he would, but I was just like, if he's far away, it's not ideal. But
thank you, and we hope that it ends quickly and we can come and enjoy your art. I see that you have put the link to the opera, so that's it's great. Before we leave, I have one more guest actually today. Ivany, do you want to? Hi. We can't see you. Do you have your camera on?
I do.
Here we are.
There we go.
Ivany Bide is the librarian at Goldsmith Hall, and she's just coming to say hi. I wanted to introduce her because she's our first guest speaker for the series we're doing in June in partnership with Goldsmith Hall and Goldsmith Fair, about the history of the hall and the women who have shaped silversmithing and jewelry in the UK. Ivany went 2 weeks ago, you went down in the archives. Tell us a little bit about that quickly, because that's really, it's a fascinating story, and it's going to be one of the starting points of our conversation on June 3rd.
Yes, well, I hope some of you have seen a little bit of that footage. I actually went again today because I have to go every 2 weeks to check the archives, the temperature and the humidity down there in the vault. We have records that stretch back to the early 14th century. So our earliest document records life in 1334. So we've managed to look after them for nearly 700 years. So we're doing our best to make sure that they stick out the crisis as well. One of the great pleasures of going down into the vaults is there's such a mix of material down there, which normally you don't see. It was lovely when I went down 2 weeks ago and took my phone with me and recorded a few bits and pieces. be able to get out some of our most important things. So we had one of our books of ordinances, which are the rules of the Goldsmiths Company, as well as some things to do with assaying and hallmarking. So it tells all kinds of different stories about what goldsmithing meant in the past, but also what it means at the moment as well.
Right. Well, I mean, it's really exciting. It's what's extraordinary also is that the building has been there in the same place since 1327, is that right? And that it has survived bombings and plagues and all that, and the records are still there. So that's quite spectacular.
Yeah, it is. It's an amazing survival story. So the first hall actually is slightly after 1327. That's when we got our royal charter. So it's 1339, and so we've been there ever since that point. And just the stories the building has to tell, as well as being an absolutely fantastic location. It's a Grade 1 listed building. It's used in all kinds of films and for TV sets as well. So it's a gorgeous place, but it also has quite a powerful history behind it.
Well, thank you so much for popping in. I just wanted everybody to meet you in advance of our upcoming series of lecture. Thank you, everybody. Next week, our guest is Charlotte Hodes, and Charlotte is also from the UK. She is a fine art artist who crosses between fine art and craft. She does collage and drawing with a scalpel, and uses ceramic and among other materials as her base. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Have a great week. It looks, at least in Canada, that spring has arrived. Enjoy, and thank you again, Joel and Miriam. It was lovely to have you. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Eleni.
Bye, Isabel.
Bye, Eva.